the actual day of the transfer, the D-Day, or I guess the T-Day. The super, super exciting day when you finally get to try for the first time, or maybe you've already tried multiple times, but I think it always stays exciting because, of course, there's so much hope attached to it, so many emotions, so many feelings. You went through so much to even get to that day. So I just remember it being such a, nerve-wracking, positive day, and I took the day off just to also, give myself a bit of time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Very Beginning. So excited that you're joining me again. This time I'm recording on a Wednesday, so actually giving myself a whole day to edit. The last weeks have been so crazy busy that I always only manage to record literally on Thursday when I'm releasing episodes. What's always made it such a marathon to edit everything and get it all ready to release the same day. So hopefully by doing it a day early, I'm giving myself a bit of a buffer, but I'm sure anyone can relate to those busy periods of your life that sometimes just overwhelm you and you still try to find balance in it all. But today I'm excited to get in the third and really last part of this entire IVF cycle that I've been breaking down in the last over the last couple of weeks. So if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, I suggest you go back. But especially if you are interested in learning kind of the step by step what happens in an IVF cycle, I have one episode that talks kind of all about that stim process, the medication, the stimulation, what it is, why, how to do shots, all of that. And then last week we talked about all things egg retrieval. We talked about the procedure itself, then the embryo development, and then the PGTA testing. And then today is actually kind of the big showdown, the embryo transfer, like what happens when you're ready to try and transfer one embryo, how the experience was for me. Again, there's always disclaimer, not a medical professional, just talking about my personal experience in the hopes that it can help someone out there to feel less alone, and just, yeah, inform someone out there who's maybe going through the same or considering going through something similar and is just interested in learning how it all plays out. So essentially today I'll be talking about my experience with the embryo transfer. As mentioned in the previous episode, we did a frozen embryo transfer and we also did PGTA testing. So that's kind of like upfront if you haven't listened to the previous episode, because that's quite important. I know for a fresh transfer, the procedure is quite different. So I can only talk about what I experienced. So for us, we decided to let my body calm down a bit after the egg retrieval, to give it at least one cycle in between, so to let my kind of period come naturally afterwards, to before we even try our first embryo transfer. As I mentioned, we did also do the PGTA testing, so that just allowed enough time to get those results, because that also takes a little bit to get them. So that for that cycle, I guess, after my egg retrieval was a bit different. And I think that's also always the question that people ask, a question certainly that I had. It lasted a bit longer. So usually my cycles are around 30 days. The one after the egg retrieval was around 34. So nothing like drastic, but still a bit longer, and also a bit like more painful and heavier, which I guess is to be expected. I remember actually when that period came, we were standing like in line in a really long customs line at the airport. So it's always like in the worst possible moment, but once again shows us that we women are superheroes, kind of managing all of that and dealing with all of it. But yeah, so we had actually gone on vacation. I think that's also important to know for someone who's maybe then planning to do the embryo transfer. If you know that you want to, start it with your next cycle, you have to really inform your clinic. And no matter if you decided to wait a cycle between the egg retrieval and between the embryo transfer, maybe you waited a year for whatever reason, just so you're kind of aware that you do need to inform your clinic beforehand, not just like when your period starts or the day off, because it is a bit of also kind of planning and preparation needed, since you do need to take certain medication from day one of that new cycle. I'm going to get into that medication schedule, but essentially for us, it even like coincided with going away for traveling, which was not a big issue, but we just had to plan it out that we take all the medication with us. So we didn't know when that cycle would start. Then my doctor was informed, right? Because then you also have to go in again for monitoring. So just kind of to give you the information that it is best to, communicate with your clinic way in advance before you actually want to try an embryo transfer. So, in terms of the medicine schedule, I mentioned that from day one you have to take something, and in my case, I had for I guess in preparation for the embryo transfer, had to take quite a lot. It's even like more than in the stim process, which I found a bit surprising because you always kind of hear about those shots that you need to do in the stimulation process. So I thought like, oh, the worst is behind me, but actually for the embryo transfer there's also a lot of medication you need, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, since here it's so important to really build out that uterine lining to prepare your body to receive that little miracle hopefully that will stick. So yeah, I guess in retrospect makes sense, but just again, as like a helpful tip, hopefully for you, that prepare yourself while you can be so proud for having achieved the stimulation phase and having done that, and that's awesome. But just prepare yourself that there is a lot more to come, because I think it can be sometimes hard if you just go in, without kind of being prepared for that. So for me, from day one, I had to take a combination of pills and patches that were both some type of estrogen. So, and here I think it's really helpful as we talk about those different medications and hormones to remind ourselves of kind of how that natural cycle works and all the different hormones that are at play there. And I do also have an episode on that, so I can link it below if you're interested in it. But essentially, right, like you're trying to almost mimic what your hormones are normally doing, but just I guess with a little more vavoom's behind it, just to create that much more of like a fertile environment. At least that's how kind of my doctor explained it to me. So I had to take those estrogen pills and patches from day one, and they're usually so for like a week you just take them and you don't really go into the clinic, or at least in my case I didn't have to go in because there wouldn't probably be much that they would see that early on in your cycle. I mean, also like day one of your cycle you're still on your period, so I had to go in for the first time on day 8, where they checked like it was like an internal ultrasound. At that point you're very familiar with them if you have reached that point in your IVF process. And yeah, so he checked kind of how my uterine lining was thickening and how it was looking, and he seemed happy with it. So that was like a good news that we got there. So I had to continue with my medication as before, with like the estrogen pills and patches. I think I also had to give some blood work just to measure the different hormones. And I believe from day 13, I also had to take additional medication, which was progesterone pessaries and also progesterone injections. I know progesterone, there's different type of injections. Some you have to can you give like in your belly, others you have to give in your glute muscle. I know the glute muscle one can be really painful. I actually was able to do the ones in the belly, which was, I mean, I think it was burning a bit, but it wasn't too bad. I think the intramuscular ones can really hurt quite a bit. So here, again, advice maybe you go back to my stim episode where I was talking about kind of the things you can do to help relieve that pain and discomfort, because I think cooling here is super important. But yeah, so day 13 I had to add those shots and pessaries, and also started taking a high dose of folic acid. And here again, I think it makes sense to think about, right, that in your natural cycle, progesterone increases. So you have the progesterone high after you ovulate. So that's, I guess, why it makes sense that it's day 13, kind of around that middle of your cycle, when almost with the medication, right, you're trying to tell your body, like, oh, and that's like ovulation happened, and now we're kind of preparing to receive the embryo. So then for the actual transfer, so I think around day 13 they also did another scan to see how things were progressing and how the uterine lining was thickening. And at that point they can usually already schedule you in for the embryo transfer, so you will receive the actual date, which is super exciting. I remember I think I had put it in the calendar as like tentative, because they do have to like measure your hormone levels and do a few more ultrasounds to really confirm, is that uterine lining, is it thick enough? Is it looking good? Because of course here it's super important to remember and think about that most of the time. I mean, some people maybe get super lucky and have like 10, 15 embryos, but you don't hear that very often. I think in most cases, you do have a very, very finite amount of embryos. So a very finite amount of chances that you can try transferring it. So of course, as your clinic, as your doctor, they really want to ensure they give you the best possible chance of a positive outcome. So I think, I've heard also of cycles being canceled because for some reason, the uterine lining wasn't thick enough, or, the medication wasn't working as it should. And while I didn't experience that myself, but I think here it's just important to acknowledge that that happens, and that those like cycles sometimes have to, be kind of interrupted or stopped, or, and I think in these cases the doctors don't, are not your enemy. They don't mean it like in a bad way, that like, we can't try the embryo transfer, because I get it. It's such a tough, long process, and you just want to, give it a go. You want to give it a try, and you're just hoping for the best outcome. But I think mentally it just helps to know that it's best to wait until you really have the best chances, because you don't really want to almost waste, and I want to be careful with that word, but you really don't want to waste a precious embryo. So so on that day 13, when I had to take the progesterone, also we did also schedule my transfer for day 18 of my cycle. So after that, there were kind of like a couple more blood tests to follow, but then it was pretty much quickly confirmed for day 18. And then in terms of medication, I then had to add one more shot at the night of the transfer, and I'll go into the transfer in detail next. Just want to finish that medicine schedule chapter. So I had to add an HCG shot after the transfer, on the evening of the transfer. And HCG, like some of you might be familiar with it, that's actually the hormone your body starts producing when you are pregnant. So I was also a bit confused, like, why am I giving that to myself? I know also HCG is used actually in the stimulation process as a trigger shot. But here, I mean, I think there were some studies that showed that, especially with a frozen transfer, like in our case, giving yourself an HCG shot in a quite like a high dosage after the transfer can increase the chances of a successful implantation. So that's why I had to do like one shot in the evening. And then the last medication, as I said, it is quite a bit that I had to take, was a blood thinner. Again, I had to start taking that following the transfer. And I think here again, I think studies show that it can increase the chances of implantation. So that was the last medication I had to add. So this wild mix of pills, patches, pessaries, several shots was what I had to stay on for, I think, at least the next 10 days until you do kind of that blood test to confirm whether the transfer worked or not. But before I get to that, I want to get into the actual day of the transfer, the D day, or I guess the T day, the super, super exciting day when you finally get to try for the first time, or maybe you've already tried multiple times. But I think it always stays exciting because, of course, there's so much hope attached to it. There's so much, so many emotions, so many feelings. You went through so much to even get to that day. So I just remember it being such a, nerve-wracking positive day. And I took the day off just to also, give myself a bit of time to feel as relaxed as possible. As you know, I am a huge, huge fan of acupuncture. I did it all throughout my stim process. So here, I also made like a little plan with my acupuncturist and naturopath to see like in what best way can, she support the transfer. And there are again some studies showing that it's best to do it right before the acupuncture, the transfer, and then right after. So on the day of the transfer, I actually had 2 acupuncture appointments, one in the morning, at the transfer in the afternoon, and then went back to acupuncture right after in the late afternoon. Try to take really the day as relaxed as possible. One thing that I want to kind of give to you so you're prepared for it, you have to drink a lot of water. And you're not allowed to pee. I mean, not for the entire day, but I think at least like 2 hours before the transfer. And your clinic will advise you exactly of the instructions. But I think the reason for this is that your bladder needs to be quite full for them to properly visualize everything on the ultrasound while they do the transfer. So that's just something that can be quite uncomfortable because you drink like a liter or 1.5 liters, and then you're not allowed to go pee for quite some time. So I think that's like the most uncomfortable part of it. So yeah, when we arrived at the clinic, everything was pretty much smooth. With my procedure, I did not require any anesthesia. I know that in some cases, some women, especially if you suffer with like things like PCOS, I know that transfers can also be done under like a full general anesthesia, but sometimes I think is the only way that it works because sometimes I think the pain can be too bad otherwise. But in my case, it was totally fine. I didn't really feel a thing. It was like an internal scan. It's also really fast. So as I said, you arrive, you're in a room. Our doctor did the transfer. They kind of first prepare you to make sure kind of they have a proper visualization, that your bladder is full enough, that they kind of position everything ready for the embryo. And then pretty cool, in a room next to you, so it's usually like, depending on clinic, but it's usually like an adjacent room, they have the embryologist with your embryo, and they are in parallel working on thawing it, right? Because in our case it was frozen, so that's always a bit of like a kind of nerve wracking moment because sometimes I think the percentage is quite low, but it can happen. So it's something, doesn't work out in that thawing process, and the embryo, for whatever reason, is not viable afterwards. But thank God everything went well with the thawing. Here they picked kind of the embryo with the highest ranking or the highest rating, and I talk about that in my previous episode, so suggest you go back if you're interested in the details. But yeah, I think we even got like a little picture of the embryo that we tried transferring, which I thought was pretty cool. And yeah, so the in the adjacent room, the embryologist prepares everything for the embryo. They put the embryo in like a little catheter, and then when you are fully ready and in place, only then do they bring kind of the embryo in, because things I think have to go also pretty fast, because as you can imagine, like that embryo is teeny, teeny, tiny, a ball of cells, and it has to be such a like a sterile environment to ensure that everything goes smooth. So you just like they just want to make sure kind of the woman is fully ready before they bring the embryo in. So then since everything was already in place, they put the catheter in, and then it's literally so cool because you can see like the embryo going in like a little shooting star. It literally like looked on the ultrasound like a little shooting star. I think they put it also in like a solution, like a saline solution or something, so they can actually see it on the scan, because otherwise I think the embryo would be way too small to see it. But with these solutions, literally looks like a shooting star going in, which is just so cool and fascinating. And yeah, that's it. I mean, it went super, super quick. The whole thing was maybe like 10 minutes, and then the actual like transfer is maybe like less than a minute, a few seconds. So fascinating when you think about like how quickly that all goes. And after that, you don't have to be lying down for a long time. I mean, you can chill for like a few minutes if you want to, but from a medical standpoint, there isn't really a need. I know there's a lot of always questions around this. I had questions around this myself, like should I lie still, not move, am I okay to go pee? Because again, like at that point your bladder is super full and you do really, really, really want to go, which is all absolutely fine. Like you can stand up right away, can go pee. Like I remember the doctor and the nurse was saying like it's not going to fall out. Like I mean, nothing you do now will like influence if it, will successfully implant or not. Now it's like, again, fully out of your hands, which of course makes it tricky for itself for so many reasons. But yeah, at that point in fertility or IVF world, you are considered to be pupil, which means pregnant until proven otherwise, which I thought was a really cute term. And yeah, the thing that we also did right after, before going home, was getting McDonald's fries. It's like this little weird thing. I don't know if you've heard about it, and I'm not even a McDonald's fan, like, but it's, I think it has something to do with the salt. And I don't know if there's studies or if it's maybe just kind of in the fertility IVF world, someone started doing it and then saying like, oh, I had success with it. So it's like this myth or like this good juju that some people do. But essentially, it's like this thing that after the embryo transfer, you get McDonald's fries. I think it comes from the fact that back when more fresh transfers were being done, and the risk of OHSS was quite high, that overstimulation that I've talked about in the previous episodes. The salt in the fries just can help like reduce it, because the salt like binds the water, and that's kind of the risk of the overstimulation. So I think that's where it came from. With the frozen transfer, it makes absolutely no difference, but hey, right, like at that point you're gonna try whatever myth, whatever good juju you can get, you will try to attract, because why the heck not? So yeah, after that, headed back home, took it easy. As I said, went straight to my acupuncture, was also so nice. And I think no matter if you like believe in acupuncture or not, I think it's also so important because it relaxes you so much. And I think that can never be, kind of the bad or wrong thing to do, especially after something like this, because you are of course so anxious and nervous. But that really helped to just calm down. So yeah, after that, you have to wait. Like the waiting game really begins. I did another acupuncture session on day 3 following the transfer, and then maybe another one like 7 days after, something like this, or maybe even I had to wait for the blood results first. But that's essentially the next step that you will hear from the clinic, that they will advise you to come in. Usually, and that again depends, it also depends how old your embryo was, right? Because you can transfer an embryo that was kind of frozen at day 3 or day 5 or day 6, sometimes day 7. In our case, it was a day 6 one. So they will advise you to do a blood test either like 10 days post transfer or 12 days post transfer, or in some cases, even 14 days post transfer. So for us, it was 10 days. So those 10 days were, as you can imagine, really tough, because there's nothing you can do. Like, you can't find out. You just have to wait and see. And like, obviously, you don't feel anything yet, no matter like good or bad. So that's the really tricky part. I try to keep super busy. I had like I think 3 podcast interviews scheduled that week, and yeah, just try to stay like as busy as possible, also with work and other things. And I think what's also important, or what advice I want to give you, is try not to take any pregnancy tests at home yourself, because they can be misleading. I mean, for especially in cases like mine, where you had to also do like an HCG shot, right? Like this, on the day of the transfer, I had to give myself an HCG shot. That might still be in your urine, what the pregnancy test measures, right? So if you still have that HCG injection in your system, the pregnancy test could just be picking up that test. So you could have like completely, false hopes, and like kind of almost like a false positive. And I think mentally that's even trickier. So try not to do it. I know some women, they kind of test it out. So they start testing right away on the day of the transfer, because they're actually, the test will be like super positive just because of that shot, of that HCG shot that you gave yourself. And then they will test every day to see the line getting almost thinner, to make sure like it actually disappears from their body. And then if the transfer was successful, if you are pregnant, eventually that line will start getting thicker again. So I know that some do that. But again, it is a bit dangerous, I would advise, because you can really, it's a really tough mental game, and you can really put your hopes up and then be disappointed even more. So I would just advise a little bit of caution against that. So what's next? As I said, it really depends kind of on your clinic. Some will have you go back on day 10, some on day 12. Really important to also note, no matter what your result is. So normally they say it's positive, or the transfer was successful, or you confirm pregnant, if the HCG is at least at 100. I mean, it can also be lower, and it doesn't mean right away that it's negative. I think negative is defined as under 10, but 100 seems to be that sweet spot that they're looking for. And then even more important is that in any case, they will have you come back 48 hours later to see if that HCG has doubled. So that's, I think, even more important than that first test, because if it has, then they finally confirm that you're pregnant, because if you are, that HCG tends to double every 24 to 48 hours. So just to be prepared, like these will be like the 2 blood tests that you have to take. So if it was successful, then congratulations, and I'm so happy for you. I think as the next step, probably your doctor will advise you to come for an ultrasound, which usually is around week 6 or 7. So probably at this point, around like 2 or 3 weeks later. And at that stage, they can confirm if the pregnancy is viable, if it's in the right spot, right? Because especially with IVF, you do sometimes have the risk that the embryo might implant somewhere where it's not supposed to, like in the fallopian tubes. It's quite low, but still the risk is there, and it is a bit higher even than in a naturally conceived pregnancy. So that will be kind of your next milestone. I think after that, you literally graduate from the fertility clinic. If the transfer was not successful, it's such a tricky position to be in. I know there was so many hopes put up, and it just must be really, really tricky. But I think here, just so you're kind of prepared to what happens, you would then basically wait for your period to come. Um, it wouldn't really be like much heavier. Usually, I mean, it could be a little heavier than usual, but yeah, you would usually wait for it to come and then kind of make a plan with your doctor to see if you want to try again with your next cycle, or maybe give your body some time to rest. Of course, it's a really, really tricky position to be in. And yeah, I truly hope whoever out there is going through this, that you don't have to try so many times to, before it sticks, but just to have realistic expectations. Like sometimes it doesn't work right away, and that's also okay. And I think something to also mentally prepare for. But yeah, in terms of us, I know I share a lot on here, and as I said, like with my mission to really help women, I am not going to share yet if this first transfer is successful or not. I'm simply not really ready to talk about that yet. I will eventually, as I said, with so many topics that I share, they are so personal. Like with my miscarriage, for instance, I wasn't ready to share it for a really long time. Now I am able to talk openly about it. So I am talking about it. I'm actually planning even a whole episode on it, but I just ask for a little bit of privacy and understanding that with that, I'm not going to share right away on here if it was successful or not. But yeah, that essentially concludes the three-part IVF step-by-step series. I hope I covered as much as I could. At least I tried to cover, from my personal experience, give you any tips that helped me, any advice that down the line, I found helpful that I received. I will have another 1 or 2 episodes in this IVF bucket. I think especially the mental health side is something that I want to talk a little bit more in depth about, because I think it's something that is not talked about quite in depth normally, and I just found it to be the trickiest part, so I want to dedicate a whole episode to it. But yeah, as always, if there are any questions, anything is unclear, you have any, kind of open question marks about how it all goes down, do shoot me a note. Follow Very Beginning on Instagram or TikTok. You can also direct message me there with any questions. Of course, would really, really appreciate if you like this episode, subscribe if you're on YouTube, or leave a review if you're on a podcasting platform. But thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this episode helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next time.